Borla with the Sisters Oregon-based Roundhouse Foundation. Just half of 1% of philanthropic dollars in this country go to Native American causes and projects. That's far less than the 7% that go to rural communities. It's a blind spot for many philanthropic organizations, and there are a lot of reasons for that. But our job is to examine those reasons, overcome those barriers, and do our best to show up. Part of showing up is about listening and learning and finding the teachers. Bobbie Conner is one of those teachers, and I've learned so much from her over the years. Bobbie Conner is one of those teachers, and I've learned so much from her over those years. Bobbie Conner is one of those teachers, and I've learned so much from her over the years. She's a cultural leader and enrolled member of the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla. For almost 30 years now, she's been the director of the Tamaslikt Cultural Institute on the Umatilla Reservation in eastern Oregon. If you haven't visited, I highly recommend making the trip. It's an incredible learning experience with a variety of exhibits and other ways to showcase the rich cultural heritage of the Cayuse, Umatilla, Walla Walla, Nez Perce, and other Indigenous nations from this region of the West. I started out my conversation with Bobbie by asking her about the origin of the Tamaslikt Cultural Institute and why it's so important to her people.
We wanted this place. The tribe's leadership agreed that we would build such a place to tell our story with the idea that we would own it, we would operate it, and we would not have any censorship on our messaging. So that is true today, full 100% on all three of those counts. And the purposes that were established for this institution were threefold. One, we would present the most accurate depiction of our history and our culture represented anywhere, because it's often misrepresented. Second, we would contribute to the tribal economy, and so we create not only jobs, but we have revenue in the admissions, revenue in the kinship cafe, revenue in the museum store, where a lot of native crafts and arts are sold and made by people in our community as well as neighboring tribes in the plateau and elsewhere. And the third purpose was that we would help perpetuate the knowledges and technologies of our people, because we want our cultural identity to extend well into the future. And part of that motivation comes from the fact that in the 1950s, anthropologists believed, because of the boarding school impact on tribal languages, that we would become culturally indistinct or culturally identifiable. Because we weren't speaking our language, we would become sort of this melting pot of American Indians across the United States. And that was very likely to be true post-World War II, because we were moved to cities for jobs. Some tribes were terminated, and there were federal policies that were aiding in that idea of cultural extinction for us. But the one thing that no one banked on the federal side of the equation, was that we would make reservations cultural strongholds. And cultural stronghold is what the reservation is. It's a subset of our massive homeland that we once had free will access to. But that subset has become a central location. So people come home after college, people come home after working 25 years somewhere else, people come home to be buried, which is the ultimate homecoming. So there are many ways that people come home, but the majority of our membership lives within a 5-hour drive of this reservation. And we have about half of our population of about 3,100 living on or near the reservation. And if they're near, it's usually because there's not enough housing here to accommodate everybody having the dwellings they need. So we're here to tell our story, and Tamaslikt is the place that we do that. And we use a few devices to try and get visitors to get immersed in the idea that they're in another place that's not usual. So tribal language, you will hear it spoken, you will hear it on audio and video content in the exhibits. You will hear coyote stories, you'll hear ambient animal sounds, and you'll hear teachings and voices of elders and others. And the idea is that you see words you cannot pronounce, on the walls. You hear words you cannot repeat, and it gives you a strong sense that you're in someone else's country. And that's what we want people to understand, is that this was and is and will always be our homeland. Regardless of who has jurisdiction or ownership, we still think of this vast expanse as our homeland, and it always will be in our hearts.
Mhm. One thing I love about the Cultural Institute is not only your ability to share the story of your home and of your people, but of who you are today as well. There is this whole component of we're still here. Talk a little bit about how you're doing that work and why that's so important.
Well, the permanent galleries are organized into three themes: who we were, who we are today as a modern tribal nation doing modern business with contemporary challenges, and who we'll be in the future. And that's banking on the idea that we're going to be able to continue to be in existence, and that in order for that to be true, we have to live up to the ancient laws that take care of this land, that take care of all of the species that are supposed to be here, including extirpated species, and that we're taking care of each other. And the idea that's the proposition that's introduced in the who we were is the ancient teachings that have sustained us for more than 15,000 years, and the idea that who we are today, we are still a hunter-gatherer society, even though we have full-time jobs doing all kinds of things. And so we still dig roots, we still pick berries, we still hunt, we still fish. And so we still gather medicines and paints and materials. So that ancient life way and that ancient knowledge is still alive amongst our people. And we don't want it ever to be forgotten because it has sustained us for so long. And in a crisis, we would look to that teaching to sustain us again. So as we work now as a tribal modern nation, we're working on climate adaptation and climate resiliency and the response to all of the conditions that are difficult for us. Um, and the true challenge in getting back on our feet, it's not just economic recovery from the debilitating effects of colonization, but it's also mental, social, and emotional, as well as cultural rehabilitation to be our whole selves again. And part of that is keeping our languages alive, keeping our traditional longhouse teachings alive, so that we can still be informed by those ancient teachings. And when we think about being in this modern world, we are excited that we have language taught in our charter school, and we have young people who can go and speak fluently and compete in language bowls. There's other tribes who speak similar languages, but they can make our elders proud that they can go and talk about the Snake River and dams and salmon recovery and salmon extinction using our tribal languages, that they are well prepared to represent us well into the future. And that modern identity that we're trying to share with the public is really important for lots of reasons. But all of the things that we are today are not isolated from our past, and they're not separate from our future. It's one continuum. And for us, it's not a linear conversation, it's a cyclical conversation. So we are the handmaidens of our ancestors' dreams and prayers. Our ancestors made huge sacrifices so that we could be here today. And so we owe them not just a debt of gratitude, but we also have to carry on the work they began and uphold the laws that they live by. And so, from my perspective, our traditional law only exists if we keep it alive. No one else will do that.
I want to touch a little bit on the economic side because this show is about philanthropy and how philanthropy can better support rural and indigenous communities. But I think it's important to talk about the gambling piece and casinos because that's often a
Yeah,
misconception that
absolutely.
tribal institutions have casinos. They don't need any money. They are incredibly wealthy. Can you talk a little bit about that? You have some background in from the Small Business Administration and from your work in economies. Can you just touch on that a little bit?
So the net proceeds of the gaming operation here is a very small but important discretionary fund that the Board of Trustees can then apply to its priorities. So while we may have close to $500 million budget that includes a lot of federal and state programs, I mean, we're restoring fish populations in 3 river basins. We're we're working with water quality and air quality and, as I said earlier, climate resilience. So we have a lot of federal and foundation and state funds coming this way towards the functions, many of them project based. So with Bonneville Power Administration and others, but discretionary money to put towards burial of tribal members, discretionary funds to invest in a scholarship program for our tribal students, the ability to invest in elder pensions, something we've never had before, the ability to invest in a tribal language nest for preschool education, and many fundings, many projects that don't receive outside funding because they're focused on this tribal community. And there are many funders who say, if you're not serving the general public, we can't touch it. You have to be serving more than one population. You have to be serving a diverse population. Well, believe me, in our tiny population of 3,100 tribal members, we're very diverse. We're really diverse in that microcosm. But funders see it as if it's only serving community members or only enrolled members, for example, we pitched a few years ago to one foundation, multi-generational language camp, where we would set up teepees at Indian Lake on tribal land. We would have activities every day with hopefully a youth, adult, and elder generation in each of the camps. And what we would be doing is trying to do language immersion as well as perpetuating technologies about how to make things, how to clean fish, how to pan hides, whatever it was the focal point of activity was, that it would be done in an immersive environment. And a proposal was rejected because it focused on the tribal community, not a broader audience. And yet, if the shift that we've seen now, with a few more folks being willing to provide operating support, we have some more discretion about how we use those funds, so we can put them into both operating support and function that has our ability to prioritize within our staff and our department. And so when I look at this massive tribal budget that the Board of Trustees has, our governing body has jurisdiction over, a very small percentage of that comes from gaming. And to further that discussion, I'll just harken back to a couple of projects I've been involved with. So remembrance of the Oregon Trail anniversaries, the 175th anniversary, or the 150th anniversary of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Trying to talk to tribal governments about making things that are activities and promotional and tourism based a priority when they're trying to figure out how to fund care of children who are homeless because of domestic violence, or elders who have homelessness issues because of health concerns and overcrowding in homes. The board has to prioritize the urgent needs of our community. For example, the burial fund ahead, and tribal youth scholarships ahead of things that we can get project funds for. And that discretionary funding from gaming makes that possible. The other part that is really critical to understand is we have no tax base. We are running a tribal government with no tax base. This is federal trust land that the reservation exists on. And so there's no tax coming at us, not county, not state, not federal. So I look at gaming as our tax base.
Mm-hmm. And paying for critical infrastructure, fire, water, sewer, fire prevention.
EMTs, EMTs, all of it, yes.
Mm-hmm.
We,
And I
we
think
and
that's a piece that's, I'm sorry to interrupt, but not, it's not clear to folks, right?
Right,
Especially if you don't live in that community or
right.
understand how that works. And so I think that's a really important piece to recognize about how communities really pull together, right? And I love the definition of philanthropy, right? It doesn't have to be a big gift. It doesn't have to be just cash. It's the care for one another. So, and talk about, because now that you're in the role here at Tamaslikt, how you have to fundraise for these projects and you have to be able to pull in other dollars. What does that look like living outside of Pendleton on the reservation? What does that look like working with funders? What are ways that funders get it right? What are ways that they could do better?
Let me just mention that one of the things that I've always been fascinated by in this position in Eastern Oregon is that there's been a lot of resource extraction headquartered in Eastern Oregon, and most of that wealth resides on the west side of the state.
Hmm.
So it didn't stay in community. That wealth didn't all stay in community. And so when we look to create an endowment um, for a nonprofit in Eastern Oregon, we have to look hard to find people who will help endow um, something that might contribute to our sustainability much further down the road. So Crow's Shadow Institute of the Arts exists on our reservation. I believe it is the only master printmaking studio on an Indian reservation in the entire United States. That's remarkable. And it's a remarkable opportunity for economic development, for emerging artists to create in a way that they did not realize was possible. There's just, it's an enormous boost to potential careers in the arts. So, and we have world-renowned print people, artists coming here to do residencies in printmaking. But in this rural environment, getting people to understand, one, that casinos don't take care of all our needs. They are tip of the iceberg. Two, that in a reservation economy, there are so many critical needs that when we talk about doing a language program in a museum, it's not going to serve the same purpose as the language program in the education department, which is instruction. We're going to create something. The language program in the education department publishes a dictionary. They did that in 2014. They worked with Google. We now have the Umatilla Dictionary online available to anybody who wants to look up how to say bull elk or cow elk in any one of either Umatilla, Walla Walla, or Nez Perce in that dictionary. So we're not in a static or stagnant environment. We're very dynamic. We're change makers in our own rights. And the museum and the tribal government are both moving forward, but we don't always have partners that want to move forward with us. So we're always looking to network. We're always looking to partner. And we're really, with foundations, I think the true beauty is people who are flexible to hearing the need and saying, that doesn't fit in this category, but if we had a conversation about how it might fit in this, we could provide some technical assistance to help you get there. So we might explore it at this level as an introduction to each other and go from there. So people who are willing to help us figure out how to play ball with them are really, really our best new friends.
Yeah. I love that phrase, change makers, right? Just adapting and recognizing, hey, we have to continue to move forward. We didn't finish this project and now it's over. And then we forget about it. It's, our friends in academia do that a lot, right? Oh, I wrote that paper. Then it's on the shelf. So how do we find the ways to continue to utilize what you've learned and then build on that to do it again or add components to it? I think it's
Well,
really important.
you're very right. So one of the things that's true about us is we get funds sometimes and we have great plans, great ideals, the blueprint for what we're going to do in the future. Then we find in a rural community that we don't have contractors who want to play ball at the price tag they estimated it out when we wrote the grant or the proposal. The contractors come back at 300-400% of what they said before because they know that they're the only game in town and they're the only one responsive to our request for quotes or bids. So having rural resources that meet the demands of these businesses is a challenge. If you're not a big kid buying a $100 million project or a $30 million new school building or whatever, then you're low on the totem pole for getting services from these vendors. Secondly, with funding, that's why flexibility is so important, is that we're solving other problems besides that resource. The labor pool here, one of the remarkable things about the Confederated Tribes of Umatilla is that we have a 2% roughly unemployment rate. We have about a 10% approximately not seeking employment. That's different than unemployment. So if you're not looking for a job and you're out of the labor force for chronic health, legal issues, financial issues, care of others issues, then job availability means that we have a small pool to hire from. So we want to hire a language expert. We may be going completely out of this market for that labor pool. We may be bringing someone from Berkeley, California, or the University of Montana, or somewhere else to work with us to engineer a project through. And their limited housing availability, we're all still working on that, but bringing them here with a wage that allows them to live in what we consider exorbitant prices for rentals in Pendleton. We're rural, but the cost of living, all the inflation has hit this rural community, even though we're not keeping pace with it. So with housing, new housing starts, and so it's a conflation, I guess, of the issues.
I wanted to take a minute and talk about another project that is a little bit further away, but still in the homelands. The Wallowa Homeland project in Wallowa, Oregon, is 2 hours, hour and a half from where you are.
Yep.
You've been involved in that project from the very beginning. And for folks that maybe aren't in Oregon, the Nez Perce tribe is not a federally recognized tribe here in this state. They're federally recognized in Idaho. But homelands overlap. They're not, we're ignoring the colonized state lines. So talk about the Homeland Project and your role with that project.
So, Walla Walla is the name of the people who inhabited that valley, Walla, and that is one band of Nimipu, Nez Perce people, and we were evacuated under force of the United States government in 1877. In 1855, the Wallowa homeland, what is now Wallowa County and a little bit more land than that, was part of the Nez Perce Reservation in the 1855 treaty. In 1863, another treaty was negotiated because gold was discovered in the Nez Perce Reservation confines. And so they reduced the reservation, another massive dramatic reservation reduction of reserved lands. And the five headmen who did not agree to that treaty of 1863, their lands were taken by the United States government, and that includes the Wallowa homeland. And we have been conducting a Wallowa homeland celebration and feast since 1991 there for multiple purposes. One, to create a welcoming place for the diaspora of our people, the Looking Glass, the White Bird, the Joseph band, the many descendants post-war that ended up on the Colville Reservation because they were not welcomed back to the Nez Perce Reservation, and some of them chose to come here to the Umatilla Reservation. But there are people at Warm Springs and Yakima and Colville and Umatilla and Nez Perce, as well as people in Canada and Oklahoma, who are related to this exile story from the Wallowa homeland. And it's a remarkable story because, one, it's a magnificent country, just spectacular, beautiful landscape. It's like none other in Oregon. In addition, there are only about 7,500 residents in that county. So there are a lot more livestock probably than there's people in that county. And that's probably true of many of our rural counties, but it was never a question about whether there was enough land for all of us. It was the idea that our people needed to be evacuated from that because settlers wanted us gone. So the Wallowa Homeland Project now has 320 acres on what's called Whiskey Creek Road, on the Wallowa River. And that is a place where we welcome people to come camp, to come feast. We have a longhouse so we can practice our traditional, not only way of life with our first foods and with ceremony, funerals, namings. We have a conditional use permit for our cemetery on top of what's called unceremoniously and inappropriately Tick Hill. It's not that there aren't ticks up there, but that's not its name. And so the many functions that we have in the Wallowa Homeland Project are to build bridges with the people who live there now, because the one thing we share with them is our love of that beloved place. They love it. They want to take care of it. They want to steward what's wonderful about it the same way we do. We want, however, we're a little more ambitious, the Nez Perce tribe and others, but with leadership from the Nez Perce Nation of Idaho, are trying to put fish back in the rivers, trying to create meandering streams rather than channelized rivers, trying to improve the quality of the habitat and the riparian zones. And so all of that work, including the potential replacement of the old dam at the foot of Walla Lake, to include fish passage, we hope. All of those ambitious goals are really being pushed by tribal people from everywhere. This diaspora from the War of 1877, it's called a war. I just want to clarify that it was not armed combatants on both sides. It was women, children, and old people, as well as some armed men on the Nez Perce side. And it was at great cost to our people, and it's still a tragedy and a travesty that we work to heal and reconcile and overcome. But that diaspora coming together in the Wallowa Valley in that magnificent place, it's an opportunity to heal and grow together and develop stronger bonds with our neighbors. And it's a big blessing for us. Two of my sisters are buried there. Three of my uncles are buried there. So, if not four. So, it's a blessed place to come home to. And for us, I remind my family members that young Joseph, our relative, they would not allow him to be buried there. So those of us who can exercise the option to be buried there should do so.
Yeah. It's such a beautiful place, as you've mentioned, and the overarching feeling of welcoming for relatives and folks from that homeland, as well as others and neighbors, is so palpable through all of the efforts. And I just want to highlight the Tamaslikt celebration that's in July of
Yep.
every year. We'll certainly put links to that so folks can learn more. But as always, I so appreciate you and thank you for sharing and being here, talking about things that you're working on. It's just such a gift to be in your circle.
Well, I'll tell you what, the Roundhouse Foundation has just blown us away with one, your willingness to ask questions and support the efforts of not only advocacy and stewardship and the arts and culture, as well as development. And one of the blessings, there have been a few blessings in my life, one of which is when I first got this job, I started looking at places like the Oregon Community Foundation and saying, other nonprofits in other parts of the state have endowments. How do we start down that road? So we have Tamaslikt, unlike most of our partners, I can't say that we're going to get to our goal. I mean, we need to get to about 55 million to have an endowment that would help keep the lights on and staff going. But we have at least about $500,000 towards in an endowed fund. And we have amassed through donations what we call our treasures fund so that we can advance that towards the purchase of a collection that's pretty pivotal to us that you're aware of. And all of those networks and collaborative opportunities have really been boosted by Roundhouse's advocacy, not only in grant makers, and organizations of, funders roundtables and all of those kinds of things, you are introducing a lot of people to us, and not only congressional and arts and culture organizations, but other philanthropists. And that has been such a blessing. I hope you understand how deep our gratitude is.
Oh, well, thank you. And honestly, it's so great to be able to work with you and hear about all of the things that you're doing, and just to be able to build those connections is something I'm really proud of. So thank you. We've talked a lot throughout these different episodes about different ways that philanthropy shows up. And I love how Bobbie highlighted some of the other things that Roundhouse has done specifically with Tamaslikt Cultural Institute and the Confederated Tribes of Umatilla about connecting folks with other funders, with congressional leaders, with just serving as a bridge builder. I think that piece is really interesting. And to hear from her perspective how helpful that has been for their organization is empowering for me, certainly, but I think says a lot about what role philanthropy can play in supporting organizations. I love that she touched on the importance of flexibility and recognizing, particularly in rural and remote communities and reservation communities, some of the additional challenges around workforce, around contractors, and just finding those resources to meet the demand. So if you get the funding, then you have to do the project. And that takes an extra step of making sure that those folks are still available or haven't changed their bid pricing or other things like that. So understanding as a funder, knowing that there are those moments, that there might be some pauses or changes, or being flexible in that space, I think is really critical. I wanted to mention, while Bobbie is the director at the Tamaslikt Cultural Institute on the Umatilla Reservation, we also touched on Tamkaliks, which is the celebration at the Walla Walla homeland that happens every July, and it's a welcoming celebration for folks back to the homeland. That's a separate organization, but a lovely place to go, place to experience the cultural heritage that's provided and given the opportunity for not only folks revisiting their homeland, but neighbors to come and celebrate alongside our Native American neighbors and friends. Check out discussion questions and more information about both programs at fundingrural.com.